over the last 4 weeks. We have almost, if I'm not mistaken, 160 people registered for this call. That includes officials, members of parliament, journalists, specialists, advisors, and so on. And of course, members of our network. So we're very, very happy that you're all with us. I want to first wish all of you a happy and healthy holiday season, Passover and Easter, and most importantly, that our families be safe and secure and healthy in our communities and countries. Elnet's main mission is to strengthen Israeli-European relations, and there's so much to talk about these days with the virus and the exit strategies and what the day after will look like in terms of the importance of the cooperation between Israel and Europe. But we will let our speakers do the talking today, so I will quickly introduce them. I will ask a few questions as we all warm up so that you can prepare your questions. This is a session focused on the political developments in Israel, but of course, we'll try to relate to the region and to the virus itself and to international cooperation, foreign policy. But let me begin, please, with no further ado. Amit Segal is a chief political correspondent and commentator for Channel 12 News, which is Israel's most popular and influential TV outlet and news outlet. He is also a correspondent for Yediot Achronot, which is the nation's best-selling newspaper. He's a popular talk show host on Israeli leading radio stations. Barak Ravid is a senior diplomatic correspondent for Israel's Channel 13 News, which is another TV station. He's a regular contributor to Axios, an international publication online, and he's a former chief diplomatic correspondent for Israel's newspaper Haaretz. He covers Israeli politics and foreign affairs and specializes in U.S.-Israel relations, Israeli-European relations, and of course the peace process and Middle East issues. So I will begin, Amit, with you. It appears that we were in the process of the formation of a new government in Israel, and there was much excitement over the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
Then it appears to be a crisis where no one is talking to each other in recent hours. So my question to you is, do we have a new government, or is this crisis real? Are we looking at a fourth round of elections, or is this tactical maneuvering between the parties?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm afraid it's too early to call. And it goes as follows. In Israel, I would call it unique electoral system is the political version of socialism. You always have to share. I think there wasn't a single case in Israel's history in which one single party got 51% of the popular vote or of the parliament, unlike, for instance, the US or the UK. So sharing is not something new to our system, but here we talk about a rotation government, which is the political version of kibbutz, of communism. You have to share everything, including the prime minister residence. And Benjamin Netanyahu found himself after 3 rounds of elections with less than 61 Knesset members, which are sufficient to declare an outright majority and form a narrow right-wing coalition. Hence, he has to pay. And the price for Benny Gantz was 1.5 years, 18 months as the prime minister, commencing October 2021. But I think what has happened over the last 24 hours is that Netanyahu found that his political base sees the price as too high a price. And his constituency, his voters do not see any necessity in paying Benny Gantz this price, in, for instance, giving him a green card to nominate the Supreme Court judges, etc. And therefore, Bibi thinks to himself, why do I have to pay such high a price? I have the time. If we go to a fourth round of election, we can actually get an outright majority. So I think now it starts as a bargaining in the market, but it can escalate in 2 or 3 weeks to a fourth round of election.
Barak, the floor is yours. A new government or a real crisis?
Uh, again, my personal opinion for quite some time, since Gantz caved and went into those negotiations with Netanyahu, was that Netanyahu didn't really want a unity government. Netanyahu's main interest was personal interest, because you have to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu's trial is supposed to start in in less than 2 months. Netanyahu's trial. The only reason that the trial still hasn't begun is because of the corona crisis and an emergency decree by the interim minister of justice. And so Netanyahu's calculations are not only political, they are much more, in my opinion, personal, considering his legal situation. And because of that, in my opinion, Netanyahu's main interest is to go for a fourth election, because he sees himself as someone who was very close in this election to have a 61 member of Knesset majority that would allow him to maybe even pass laws that will somehow give him a get out of trial free card. And I think he sees now, after he managed to get Benny Gantz into negotiations, split his party, make his the other camp, the center-left camp, basically disintegrated. Now it's the best thing for him to go for fourth elections, and I think that this was his plan in the first place.
Thank you. Amit, back to you. So the prospect of fourth elections, is this the beginning of the end of the Netanyahu era in Israeli politics, or the end of the beginning? Are we looking at an exit strategy in terms of a deal with the prosecutors, or possible presidency, or fourth round of election?
Well, I've just wrote for Yediot Aharonot, a Passover edition, that in Netanyahu's eyes, it's the end of the Netanyahu era, but the beginning of the Bibi era. I think, and you have to keep something in mind. In Israel, there is no term limit, and the election date is only a recommendation. I think there was only one case over the last 50 years in which the election date was the original one. Usually the term is way shorter than the law permits. And the combination of those two facts leads to something amazing. And this is the most amazing fact about Israeli politics. There wasn't a single prime minister in Israel's history who resigned without a force majeure loss, or after he lost an election. They always think that they will rule forever. This was the case for every single prime minister in Israel. Has had 12 prime ministers so far. But since no one can rule forever, so the outcome is that always the story of Israeli prime ministers ends up with a tragedy. Rabin was assassinated, Sharon got a stroke, Olmert went to jail, Peres was defeated in the 1996 election, Begin suffered from a depression, and I don't think that Netanyahu's case will be different. To be honest, the most suspicious thing for me is that Netanyahu was willing to set a date, October 1st, 2021, in which he will step down as a prime minister. And till we see it, we won't believe it. So the Israeli public, I think now the Israeli pundits are divided into two groups. One group does not believe that Netanyahu will even sign an agreement, and the other group does not believe it will actually keep it. So everybody thinks that he'll find a way to actually escape it, to get away with breaking the agreement with Benny Gantz. Plus, I have to say that Gantz tries to actually cross the abyss with two steps. In the first step, he actually broke Kahol Lavan, the spaceship that brought him to 33 seats. And then he has to take another step and to join Netanyahu's government. But Netanyahu sees that Benny Gantz he actually burned all the bridges behind him. And I think Netanyahu is a super efficient machine to identify political weaknesses. And I think he sees that Gantz is in his most weak position since he joined politics 15 months ago.
Barak, the floor is yours.
About the end of the Netanyahu era, before the 2015 election, I wrote an op-ed in Haaretz that said that it was the end of the Netanyahu era. Obviously, it was one of the most stupidest thing I've ever written, which tells you something about pundits and how reliable our columns are. But I will tell you a story. A few years ago, when I was still in military intelligence, I was in one meeting when General Amos Gilad, who's a very good friend, and I admire him. And he said at that meeting, he was then the head of the military intelligence research branch. And the meeting was about Arafat and what's going to happen with him when he was still alive. It was 2003 or 2004. And Amos Gilad said, Arafat is eternal. And then one of the people in the meeting told Amos Gilad, Amos, look, Arafat is not eternal. He will go one day. You are eternal. And with Netanyahu, it's not the case. With Netanyahu, because Netanyahu even succeeded Amos Gilad. So I think that at least for now, if Netanyahu goes for another election, most chances are that he will manage to get to 61 seats. The public is in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. He gets a lot of credit for a lot of the things that he did. A lot of the bad things don't stick to him, but to other ministers in the government. And again, the opposition is shattered. There's no, after 3 elections where he had a very, very strong alternative, like the blue and white party, right now, the opposition is in shatters, and I don't see any problem for him to get to 61 member of Knesset majority if he goes for another elections.
Thank you, Barak. So please use this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to begin lining up your questions. I'll ask a few more questions because there's much to cover, but feel free to ask anything that comes to your mind. Let's shift slightly to the issue that is foremost on everyone's minds these days, and it is the corona crisis. Amit, how would you rate the government's performance, the challenges, the strengths in the reaction, the response, maybe compared to other countries? And I'll ask Barak the same question.
Well, it's too early to call as well. Netanyahu's emotional position, psychological position is the prophet that stands on the tower and sees an existential threat on the way. He sees the soldiers of the enemy marching. This was his claim to fame, to declare that Iran is the new Nazi Germany and the year is not 2015 but 1938, and to see that the Saddam Hussein is the most dramatic threat to Israel, to Israel's existence. And in that respect, I think Netanyahu made Corona the new Iran. I think in January, he was the first Israeli to stop shaking hands. Maybe it's his wife that I would say it gently does not like germs. And maybe it's
that's the understatement of the century.
Exactly. And maybe it's the fact that he sees any threat as an existential one. But the fact is that Israel was, I think, one of the first countries worldwide, or even the first one to stop flights from Italy, for instance, and then from Thailand and Austria and Spain, etc. Alongside that, I think Netanyahu was the first to recognize, to identify the threat. But Israel's Ministry of Health is not very efficient, to say the least. Senior officers in the Israeli army claim that they were asked to help the health ministry over the last weeks. And they said that their experience was like helping a third world country in Africa or in, I don't know, in Central America. Our establishment, our government is not the most efficient, I would say. All in all, I think the Israel ranks quite well. It is doing quite well, but as I said, it's too early to call. By the way, this is one of the reasons why Netanyahu feels that he can actually gain ground from a new round of election, because I think most of the Israelis now rank Netanyahu as they see Netanyahu's performance during the corona as a relatively good one, compared to Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or, I don't know, Benny Gantz if he had the chance to be a prime minister. So maybe this is one of the reasons he seeks a new round of election, possibly.
Netanyahu flourishes in times of crisis, both in the way he operates the government and both politically. For him, it's always the same thing. It's not two different channels. It's always a combination. And as Amit said, what Netanyahu did since the beginning of the crisis, as he does in every crisis, is that he publicly boosts the threats. Meaning, the coronavirus is obviously a very serious crisis. Nobody underestimates it. But Netanyahu, since the early beginning, he started giving almost every other day a statement on television on prime time with an apocalyptic view of where things are headed. And in one of those statements, he said that Israel is facing 1 million, that 1 million of Israel's citizens could be infected, and as high as 10,000 people could be dead. And we will be in the same like Italy and Spain, etc., etc. Which again, it's a very extreme scenario that was part of the discussions, but it did not coincide with what actually was going on the ground and with the steps the government was taking, which were very firm, very serious, and very quick. So he did both. On the one hand, his actual actions were very serious. On the other hand, his public description to public opinion of the situation was very apocalyptic. And this is a classic Netanyahu way of doing things, because then if things go really bad, he would say, look, I told you so. And if things would be better, he would say, which he actually said yesterday, that see, it's because of everything we did. But all in all, the public right now is pretty satisfied with the way Netanyahu is running things. But the corona crisis exposed something else, because in the last 11 years where Netanyahu is in power, he was the Minister of Health for quite some time, because he had a Deputy Minister of Health, Yaakov Litzman, which he didn't want to be a minister for many, many years. So Netanyahu was the Minister of Health. Then for some time, Litzman took the portfolio full time as a minister. And then again, he became deputy minister, and Netanyahu took the portfolio again. So for some of those years, I think at least half of the time, Netanyahu was the Minister of Health, according to the law. And to say the least, the health system in Israel wasn't one of his first 10 priorities. And I think the crisis right now exposed that the health system in Israel is very fragile. It's not in line with 21st century technology, and is not equipped and to really deal with such a big crisis. And I think that, again, on the one hand, he took very positive and serious action. On the other hand, the crisis exposed a big gap that Netanyahu left in the last decade when half of the time he was the Minister of Health.
Thank you. My last question, because I see lots of questions coming in, and that's wonderful. That's what we want to see. But one more area that we really do need to cover from both of you is the issues of policy of the new government, whatever government is formed, and specifically on foreign policy issues relating to the extension of Israeli law to certain parts of the West Bank, whether the settlements or the Jordan Valley, and the fallout internationally and in the region, what that would mean. Amit, if you can start, and then Barak, and then we'll go to the floor.
Well, this is the most dramatic step Israel has taken since the Oslo Accords, but on the other way around, not evacuating territories, but actually annexing it. And one can only wonder how fast the Israeli policy has changed. I think no one would believe a year ago if I would tell you in Israel or abroad that a government that consists of 2/3 of the Israeli public, of the Israeli parliament, will have in its formative document an agreement to annex 30% of the West Bank, all the settlements in Judea and Samaria, plus the Jordan Valley, plus important territories within the West Bank. And even if Benny Gantz does not agree to it, he actually agreed to live with it. He might vote against it, but he'll live in a government that was formed under these principles. And I think Netanyahu would prefer it to be done now, when the Security Council of the UN cannot even be summoned due to the corona. I don't think that Israel will be condemned via Zoom. So, but according to the agreement, he can start the process, I think on July the 10th, which is give or take 3 months from now. And I think it's going to happen. I know I have a disagreement about it with some of my colleagues, but I think that Netanyahu really wants it because he is in a desperate need for a legacy. He's the son of a historian, and he knows that if he resigns in a year and a half from now, or even loses the next election, his way to the history books will be as the first sitting government to be, or in Israel's history, to be indicted, to have been indicted in court. And he wants to rewrite the history books and to be the first prime minister of Israel who actually got the agreement of the US to the annexation, first in the Golan Heights last year, and now in the West Bank, which is, of course, way more dramatic. And therefore, I think he's quite serious. And if he's serious, so maybe the answer for your first question, will we have a government, is positive at the end of the day, because the Americans have already declared that they will agree for an annexation only if Israel has a functioning government, not a government that was sworn in 5 years ago and keeps functioning only because we are in an election after election. So maybe if he's serious, in a week or so, he'll sign this agreement and annex 30% of the West Bank.
I agree that Netanyahu wants to go for annexation. I think that if you asked Netanyahu a few years ago whether he thinks annexation is a good idea, he would tell you no. I know that because he told me that. And I think that changed. Like many other things that changed with Netanyahu in the last 3 or 4 years. I think that the fact that you have Donald Trump in the White House was one of the main things that changed Netanyahu's worldview about whether annexation is a good idea or not. And I think he wants to do it. Whether he'll be able to do it, I think the jury is still out. First, we still need to see the exact language of the coalition agreement with Benny Gantz. It seems right now that it gives a lot of maneuvering space for Netanyahu to go forward with annexation without Benny Gantz really having the ability to stop it. By the way, Benny Gantz is totally against annexation of the West Bank, or at least the annexation that Netanyahu sees. But it's not clear whether the coalition agreement has any mechanism that would allow him to stop it. I think Benny Gantz and other people in his party, like Gabi Ashkenazi, are betting on several things that could happen in the last several months that can stop this process. And I'll give you several examples. First, which is, again, I don't think it's going to happen, but this is one of the things that could stop this process. The Palestinians agree to somehow engage on the Trump plan. Again, I think it's a very, very slim chance, very close to zero, maybe even zero. But this is, at least according to people in the Trump administration that I talked to, if the Palestinians go back to the table, then annexation would be definitely on hold for quite some time. Another scenario is that the Jordanian government and the Egyptian government would be very clear that if Netanyahu goes forward with annexation, it would lead to a cancellation or a suspension of the peace agreements. I can tell you that I met a very senior Jordanian official in Munich several weeks ago, and he couldn't be any clearer that the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan actually consists a clause that enables a suspension of the peace deal as a result of a unilateral move by another party. But I think that, at least according to what I hear from the Jordanians, very, very senior officials, they will not be able to continue the peace agreement. They will have to cancel it if Israel goes forward with annexation, especially if it includes the Jordan Valley. The Jordanians are saying that they have a commitment by the Egyptians to do the same. I'm not sure it would actually happen, but still, I think an annexation of the West Bank, according to how Netanyahu wants to do it, would most probably lead to the cancellation of the peace deal with Jordan. Netanyahu thinks it will not happen because Netanyahu thinks that Jordan is weak, and the Jordanians would condemn, but they wouldn't really do anything. And for Netanyahu, I think that in the back of his mind, he says, well, if they cancel the peace deal and the Hashemite kingdom starts to be even more unstable, and maybe even the king, the public topples the king, it's not such a bad outcome for Netanyahu. Okay, for Netanyahu and his members of the party, who actually are toying with the idea of Jordan is Palestine. Some of them are being more public about it, some of them are less public about it. But I think that for them, the end of the Hashemite dynasty is not necessarily a bad thing. So, but I think that Benny Gantz somehow is betting on that Netanyahu would, I don't know, get scared because the Jordanians would say that they would cancel the peace deal. Another thing that can happen is that the security services in Israel, both the IDF, the Mossad, and the Shin Bet, would be very strongly against it. The position right now in the Israeli security and intelligence establishment is very negative towards annexation, mostly because of Jordan, but also because of the fear of a third intifada. And there's always a possibility that, again, I don't think this is the case, but many things, Netanyahu spoke about a lot of things that he's going to do. You know, several years ago, he said that he's really going to put his hands into the issue of the cost of living in Israel. Okay, he didn't do anything with it. So I'm not saying that his thinking about annexation is like his thinking about the cost of living, but Netanyahu has a way of giving a lot of statements and implementing, let's say, a moderate part of those statements. But if you ask me if he wants to do it, he wants to do it.
Thank you. We have a first question from the audience, and we'd like to ask Dennis Ross from Washington, D.C. You have a question, Dennis?
Not yet.
Yeah. And the question I have, you both, or at least I guess Barak made the point about the health ministry and the health minister. I guess the question I have is, within the country, it appears that the outbreak among the Haredi is very high. You look at, I saw one figure that said 70% of Bnei Brak is infected with the virus. There's great criticism of Lieberman for how he's handled this. I understand that Bibi creates a separation from him, at least in terms of responsibility. But I wonder over time, given Bibi's reluctance to separate himself from the religious and the Haredi, and the perception within the public that they bear a lot of responsibility for the spread of the virus, is there not some potential for a political price for Bibi over time because of that?
Who's the question for? For me. Okay. First of all, thank you, Mr. Ross. It's quite complicated. Israel's right wing is not that coherent. It consists of hawkish conservatives, neo-Republicans, and the ultra-Orthodox and the National Orthodox community. And the ultra-Orthodox is the weak point of the right wing, because while most of the Israeli public belongs to the right wing from security perspective, the vast majority of Israelis identify themselves as way more secular than the right wing. Most of Israelis of the Israelis support, for instance, civil marriage, public transportation on Saturdays, etc., and breaking the monopoly of the chief rabbinate. I think what you see in the corona has a chance of becoming something bigger, as you describe it. I have to mention two things. One is that Netanyahu almost lost the September election due to a tough campaign led by Avigdor Lieberman, which was focused on Netanyahu's ultra-Orthodox allies. So there is a ground to lose there from Bibi's perspective. Second, Lieberman is one of the most unpopular ministers in this government. I have to admit that maybe it has a lot to do not only with his performance as a health minister, but because of his affiliation with the ultra-Orthodox community. That is to say that there is something about anti-religious, sometimes almost anti-Semitic sentiments. So I don't think it's something that can bring Netanyahu's political career to an end, but when he actually considers his further steps, I think what you mentioned is something against calling up an early election.
If I can just add on that, Dennis, think about it like this. On the one hand, Netanyahu, he defends Lieberman and he keeps him as Minister of Health, even in the next government, because he knows that his 7 or 8 seats in every government are almost an extension of the Likud. It's almost, it's only technically not the same party, but it's certain that they're with him in every coalition. They're voting for him in every vote. Lieberman is the most loyal soldier he'll ever have, and he brings with him another 6 or 7 loyal soldiers. On the other hand, firing Lieberman or giving them another ministry and taking the Ministry of Health from Lieberman would be, I think, the most popular decision Netanyahu would make in the last decade. Okay, firing Lieberman is really a very, very popular decision. I think that only Lieberman would be against it. And the fact that Netanyahu is not taking this very, very popular decision, but is still clinging on to his alliance with Lieberman, shows you how strategic he sees this alliance, and he thinks that even if he loses points over keeping Lieberman as the Minister of Health, it's still worth it for him to keep those 7 or 8 seats of Lieberman's party as an extension of Likud.
We have a question about the coronavirus and the government response from Harold Hyman from CNews TV channel in France.
Mhm.
And his question is, are confinement methods of the population universally accepted across party lines in Israel? And are there civil defense measures in place?
I couldn't get the question. Sorry, could you please repeat it?
Sure. So are there confinement methods of the Israeli population? Are they universally accepted across party lines in Israel? And are there civil defense measures in place? So I'm assuming that's the involvement of the military and some of the security forces.
So Israelis, I would say that Israelis are always at alert. They are always alerted. There is a joke in the settlement where I came from, Ofra, but I think it's valid for every Israeli citizen, that there are 2 options in Israel to watch the news, either to open the television or to open the window. So the sentiment that the Western world sees now, that you have to watch television in order to get updates, what you should do, to wear a mask, to go outside, am I allowed to meet my grandfather, etc., is something that Israelis are fully aware of since the 40s. And therefore, it was quite fast in Israel, the adaptation of the emergency measures. No one in Israel sees it, save a very small minority. No one sees for instance, the interference of the Shin Bet, the security services in locating the corona, the people who got corona through their smartphones. No one sees it as something which is against the democracy. We see it as something that defends democracy and health. And therefore, according to the polls that I see, the vast majority of the Israeli public supports the measures taken by the government. Plus, there is a 20-25% minority that wants the government to take even more severe measures. So I don't think there is someone in Israel left that thinks that something here is, I don't know, is not done.
I would just add one thing. The public definitely supports the quarantine policy, but the criticism you do start hearing in the last few days is about whether there is, other than the quarantine policy, final policy, whatever you want to call it, is there an exit strategy, and what the whole crisis is going to do to the economy, because I think that this is what most Israelis are concerned about, that they don't see, for example, when their kids are going to be back to school. They don't see when they're going to go back to work. They're not sure that they'll have anywhere, the place of work to go back to. And I think that this is the criticism you start hearing. There is still quite a consensus about the steps the government are taking, but you do start hearing criticism about, okay, what's the exit strategy?
Yes, we have an update now that we have 18 countries on this call. So this is very, very exciting for us, and I'm sure for all the participants. We have 2 questions from Poland. Let me begin with Michal Wojnarowicz from the Polish Institute for International Relations. Her question is more on the political side. What are the prospects for Lieberman's party, for Avigdor Lieberman's party? And a question that we partially answered already is, will the entry of blue and white change Israel's foreign policy, for example, towards Europe and the Middle East at large?
Well, as for Lieberman's prospects, he was the kingmaker, but he preferred to be the king slayer. I mean, his unique position as the the leader of a party that can actually that gives him a carte blanche for doing whatever he wants could give him even the prime minister role in a rotation government. But he preferred to be the kingslayer, to put an end to Netanyahu's career. And I think that was the moment he lost his cards. He played his cards very well for 3 elections in a row, but then he found himself in the opposition alongside the guys that he hates from the Joint Arab List. And to be honest, if this coalition is about to survive, it might be the end of Lieberman's career, because I don't see any ground to gain from being in the opposition for 4 years while your constituency, which is the immigrants from Russia, getting older, getting old and gray. And this is for Lieberman. As for the EU, what was the exact question?
Well, the question was about how would blue and white entering the government change the government's foreign policy or policy towards the Middle East and Europe?
I think Israel doesn't have, Netanyahu believes that there is no such thing as the international community. He thinks that the international community stretches from the Oval Office to the Lincoln Memorial. And therefore, in his eyes, the only important question is whether Donald Trump will be the president of the United States in January 2021 or Joe Biden. And of course, it's a totally different situation if Joe Biden defeats Trump in November or whenever the election will take place. This is exactly why he is convinced he has to take the annexation steps now. By the way, the draft of the coalition agreement makes a differentiation between the US and the EU. As for the US, it demands a full acceptance of the annexation by the American administration. But as for the EU, it writes that it is after consulting the international community. Well, consulting is something that you can take advice or not take it. But as for Netanyahu and Gantz as well, I think it depends on Donald Trump.
Barak, if you can, yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't rule out Lieberman just yet. I do see a scenario where Lieberman unites his party with Yair Lapid's party as some sort of a mega secular center right party. I think it's a scenario. About Israel's relations with the EU. Israel's relations with the EU are very bad. Israel's relations are very good with all the Eurosceptic governments in the continent, mainly with Hungary's Orban, who is, I think, Netanyahu's political twin in Europe today. And I think that because of what we mentioned earlier, the fact that Netanyahu really wants to go for annexation of the West Bank, the relations with the EU as an institution and with many of its member states are going to dramatically deteriorate. I think, at least from what I hear from senior European officials, if Israel goes forward with annexation, the EU will move forward with sanctions. There are many sanctions that the EU can do that do not demand a consensus in the council, in the Foreign Affairs Council. Netanyahu was betting for quite some time that he will be able to prevent any European moves against Israel because he manages to divide the EU from within with the help of Hungary and the Czech Republic and other countries. But there are some measures that do not need a consensus. I'll give you just one example. There's the program called Horizon Europe, the continuation of Horizon 2020, a program that in Horizon 2020 gave the Israeli R&D, in higher education institutes and in research labs. I think something like around between 300 to 400 million euros for research and development. Netanyahu tried to fight it several years ago with Horizon 2020 and the EU demand that Israeli institutes in the occupied Palestinian territories will not be part of the deal. And at the end of the day, he had to give it up and agree to the EU demands, because the Israeli R&D needs this money, and there's no substitute, and there will be no substitute in the foreseeable future. And at least from what I hear, and Horizon Europe, the new plan doesn't need a consensus in order to keep Israel out. It just needs one country that would not allow to put Israel in. So this is something that can be done very, very quickly, and I hear it from a lot of European officials. Other ideas that are going around in Brussels and in capitals is recognition of Palestine. There's a group of 6 or 7 EU member states led by Luxembourg that are ready to do it, and they're just waiting for an agreement of France or Spain. And I think that in the case of Israeli annexation, this could be a move that would happen very fast. And there are other things that are going on. I know that High Representative Borrell is working on a list of measures for a possibility of Israeli annexation. There was supposed to be a meeting about it, a discussion about it in the Foreign Affairs Council, but because of the Corona crisis, it was postponed. So I think that if Netanyahu goes forward with annexation, it would lead this way or another to European sanctions against Israel.
Thank you, Barak. We have 10 minutes and many, many questions. So we're going to I'm going to read the questions quickly, and both Amit and Barak, please answer quickly. We're going to actually unmute Eva Martinez, who is the head of the NEA division in the Spanish Foreign Ministry, to ask her question. Eva, please.
Hello and good afternoon to everybody. I'm curious about a social aspect of the corona in Israel. Here in Spain, our heroes, the medical staff, has become the undisputed heroes. No questions about that. We are united there, and a lot more disunited in many other aspects of the crisis. So I heard that in Israel, many of these medical staff belong to the Arab-Israeli minority. So my question is, if this popularity is the same in Israel, do you think that that will have a wider impact in social terms or not?
Social terms or political, I mean, a political shift towards socialism?
In both. I mean, if you could answer in both.
Well, yeah. In Israel, Israel's political system, I think, is one of the only systems on earth in which politics is not defined according to questions of money, taxation, equal justice, etc., but right and left in Israel are organized across along the axis of the borders, the Palestinian questions, security, etc. In that respect, socialist or social questions, social justice questions were off the table of the political discourse in Israel, save a very short period following the 10th protest in the year 2011. But since we are in an unprecedented event of the coronavirus, and the fact that Israel sees a number of 25% unemployment, maybe it will change. One of the most brilliant pollsters I know, Israel Bachar, which was the pollster for both Netanyahu and Gantz in the past, not simultaneously, insisted that for Israelis, the domestic questions, the money, the taxation, socialism, social justice, etc., will not be a crucial question even after the Corona crisis, especially as he explains, because it's not something which is specific for Israel. It's not a local depression. It's a huge event. So we can focus more on leadership questions like, was Netanyahu good or bad in tackling the situation, rather than changing the perspective. The sentiment in Israel, in the vast majority of the Israeli voters regarding questions of social justice, is what we call in the Jewish literature, or Jewish religious literature, as a sort of a mutual support, ערבות הדדית. And it is not the equivalent of being social democrat or socialist. And I'm not thinking it's going to change following the crisis.
I would just say that I think that, like in Spain and in other countries, also in Israel, people much more appreciate today medical staff, and I think they understand much more how important it is. I'm saying this also personally. My wife is a doctor; she's at the hospital right now treating corona patients, and I think that your question at the beginning was also about the Arab-Israeli medical staff. And this was part of the debate in the last several weeks, that there was a two very famous photos that were running around in social media in the last few weeks. One of them was of an ambulance staff. One of them, the driver of the ambulance was an Arab Muslim. The paramedic was a religious Jew, and they were both photographed praying, each of them at the same time, which was a very moving photograph. There was another very similar photograph of two doctors at a hospital, one Muslim and one Jewish, praying together. And I think it's in the last election, in the fact that the Arab Joint List managed to get 15 seats, the reason for it was a very high turnout and of Arab Israeli voters. And I think in a way there was some sort of a political renaissance for Arab Israelis. And I think the Corona crisis, in a way, helps in legitimizing political participation by Arab Israelis.
We have a question from Alice Broussard from Radio France. Experts say there's been a significant and positive shift in cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority due to the coronavirus. Can we really say so? Can you respond to that? Maybe Barak, we'll start with you.
Yeah, there is very good cooperation between Israel and the PA. The reason for it is that on the Corona crisis, the reason for it is that there are the security establishment, both in Israel and in Palestine, kept itself isolated from the political debate for many, many years. And both leaderships, I think, were pretty okay with that situation. Okay, they let the security people deal with each other, didn't interfere, because both Netanyahu and President Abbas knew that it was in their own interest. And the fact that there was a very good basis for cooperation between both security establishment, I think that right now, when we are in such a crisis, we see the fruit. But on the other hand, we see that there's a glass ceiling, meaning that when it comes to the political level, we still haven't seen a phone call between Netanyahu and Abbas, something that is, I think, that needs to happen. And I think both of them really don't want to talk to each other. And another thing that we see is that still big parts of the Palestinian leadership publicly, they still attack Israel on many things that have to do with the corona crisis. And most times it's just a bunch of lies that Palestinian officials are spreading when it comes to what Israel does or doesn't do on the corona crisis.
Amit, anything on that? You're on mute.
Mute now. And now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. For the vast majority of Israelis, the Palestinian question ceased to be something which is really important. It seems to be the number one question. It has to do a lot with the fact that the sincere attempt made by Israel to have a bilateral agreement with the Palestinians collapsed with blood and fire some almost 20 years ago. And the unilateral solution failed in the eyes of the Israeli public in 2005 in the disengagement plan from Gaza, and therefore Israel is quite forgot about the Palestinians. For them, New York, till the corona crisis, New York and London and Paris were way closer to Tel Aviv than Ramallah and Gaza. I mean, maybe Gaza had something to do with their lives because we heard sirens from due to rockets fired from Gaza, but Ramallah ceased to be on earth in the eyes of the Israelis. And the corona crisis reminds the Israelis that it's only 25 minutes by car from Jerusalem and 40 minutes from Tel Aviv. And if you have a worker from Ramallah sick with corona, it might affect our lives and vice versa. By the way, there is something which is, I mean, the craziest thing I've ever heard of is that Palestinian workers now were catched by the Palestinian police trying to actually sneak into the Palestinian Authority from Israel and not vice versa, because there was this quarantine. So we have Palestinian experiences these days. We can't get out of our house, and we're allowed to shop only for a few hours, but not due to terrorist threats, but due to the corona. I feel it will not change something dramatic in the long run. Maybe save the current feeling that the national sentiment is weaker these days than the human one. So maybe it will change something. I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much, Amit and Barak. We know that your time is precious, and everyone on this call. We could continue based on the questions we have much longer, but let's put a hard stop on it now. We want to thank all of you. We had members here of, I think, 20 countries. It's a wonderful turnout. We'll continue doing this online engagement for as long as we need to. And we hope for better days, of course, for all our countries. And please remember that while all countries are focused on national responses and competition between themselves, we believe very deeply that in the future, the importance of interdependency economically and scientifically will reemerge. And ELNET is here to build bridges between Israel and Europe, because this is our mission and we believe that it's vital for both sides. Please join our continued programs after the holiday week. Will continue in the second part of April. We'd love to see all of you again, and please stay in close touch with us as we navigate these treacherous waters together. Here again, wishing everyone a happy and healthy holiday season, happy Passover and Easter, and please be safe, and we'll see you very soon.